Hi there and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the football podcast that takes you inside the boardroom with me, Adrian Goldberg. I'm a West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder and an investigative journalist, joined as usual by Charlie Methven. Charlie has been a director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic. He's given professional advice to both Arsenal and Spurs and was a boyhood Oxford United fan. This time, now the government has announced its preferred choice for Football Regulator. It's somebody called David Kogan. Who is he? And what should his priorities be? And as Wolves women's players take to social media in protest at the lack of funding for their team had they earned promotion to the Women's Championship, how hard is it to make women's football pay? Charlie, let's talk first then about David Kogan. The government, Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, has said that he is the Labour government's preferred choice for the job. The Conservatives had apparently recommended him to Labour, although now that it's emerged that he was a Labour donor, there are some voices in the Conservative Party who were saying he shouldn't be given the job because he smacks of cronyism. But he has got quite a distinguished past in football. He's known to a lot of the main players in football through his work in helping negotiate sports rights.
Yeah, that's right, Adrian. I think it's all a bit of a storm in a teacup that's being drummed up by the Tories, who are desperately trying to find diversionary tactics at the moment from their own miserable performances in this week's elections. There's nothing wrong with David Kogan's appointment, and I don't think anyone seriously thinks that he's going to be, disadvantaged in any way by the fact that he has come from a Labour supporting background. Quite the opposite. I think having a strong working relationship with the government over the next 3 to 4 years is important. I think the fact that he's negotiated the Premier League's TV rights deals is also important, because I think one of the great fears that we all had in the industry was that someone would be appointed who just didn't have a background in the landscape. So having somebody who has a really strong background in the landscape, who doesn't have to have a reading in period when he gets his head around, well, what are Premier League's TV rights, how they changed over the years, what are parachute payments, what are all these things, would have been a delaying factor. And I think likewise, having a regulator, let's just say, for instance, that the bill had gone through under the last Tory administration before the election, and let's say the Tories had appointed somebody as the regulator who came from a more Tory background, let's say, and you then get a change of government to a Labour government. Is that helpful? I don't think so. I think that the first 3 or 4 years of this regulator are going to be absolutely critical in making sure that all parties are comfortable with the conversations they're having, comfortable that the people who are in these positions have the best interests of the sport at heart. And I think with David Kogan, that's what both the government and football industry can have, is somebody who's very experienced in the space, somebody who knows and understands this government, someone who understands what this government wants from the regulator, and somebody who won't have a reading in period.
No, and he's not going to frighten the horses, I wouldn't imagine, either from the Premier League's point of view. Just a bit of his CV. He's a former BBC journalist. He was director of the Women's Sports Group, so helped negotiate the rights deal for the Women's Super League and the Women's Championship last year. But I think more critically, in relation to his role as regulator, he was the Premier League's media rights advisor from 1998 to 2015. So when he has to speak to Premier League owners, Premier League chairmen, he will be a familiar figure, at least to many of them. He will understand their concerns. He will know what the issues are. At the same time, as you say, he will know what the government expects of a regulator. And I think from that point of view, seems a sensible choice in that he will be seen by both sides as an honest broker.
I think that's right. I think that's a very, very fair summary. Of course, we wait to see, whether he has that sort of fan credibility that the FSA would want to have as well. I haven't met David Kogan. I don't know, how sort of involved in the game he's been as a fan, etc. And maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't matter, but there might just be a question mark lingering there from the Football Supporters Association about whether he's, as a former Premier League advisor, whether he's the right guy to be protecting fans over some of the issues that fans need to be protected over. We'll wait and see on that. There's nothing to say against him on that matter. It's just that doesn't appear to be particularly his background. But I think it was crucial in this, understanding how the Premier League thinks and operates. The Premier League reminds me in many ways of Prince Harry, an immensely wealthy, privileged entity, which somehow manages to try to assume the tattered garbs of victimhood whenever it possibly can. And I think it's important that all victimhood is removed from poor dear Karen Brady and Steve Parish's robes. They need somebody to be there who they can feel comfortable with, but also somebody who understands them well enough to say, do you know what? Just pipe down. Just pipe down. I've got this. I don't appreciate you briefing in public. I don't appreciate you writing newspaper columns about this, that, and the other. I've got this. I need to be able to crack on with this. I think it is worth revisiting, Adrian, what this process is actually going to look like, and why that role, at what point that role becomes interesting and relevant. That's slightly been lost in the mists of time in amidst all of the bizarre verbiage coming from various Premier League clubs. Is, well, what's the process? What is the process? Well, here is what the process is. So once the bill passes and becomes law, which is expected to happen potentially in July, that then triggers an 18-month period for the government regulator, Kogan, and his team to come up with a review of all of the finances of the football industry, right? It's called a whole game review. So they look at the whole thing from top to bottom, take representations from all sides, and come up with a cogent overview of the industry and how it can be made more sustainable and how it can be fair and how it can be competitive and how it can sustain British advantage over, what sort of overseas competitors, etc. So during that 18-month period, the Premier League and the Football League will be making representations to the regulator as to what they think the regulator should be taking into account in its whole game review. Now, at the end of that process, or towards the end of that process, the Football League and the Premier League will both be invited to make a proposal as to what the new financial settlement should be, right? And they will make that proposal to the regulator. So it will be basically like a business plan. Both of them will submit a business plan. And the regulator will then choose the business plan that most closely resembles the findings of his whole game review, right? Now, the intention of this, which was quite smart when you think about it, was effectively to say to the Premier League and the Football League, don't make your proposals too crazy, because if the other side comes up with a proposal that's closer to the centre than yours is, then that's the one that will be chosen. And what's interesting, Adrian, is that when the regulator chooses either the Premier League's or the Football League's proposal, they then have to take just that proposal and implement just that proposal. They can't then take bits from the other proposal and change it, etc. It's either one or it's the other.
Is it?
Now, the intention of it, yes.
Really?
Yes,
well, I mean,
and the intention
presumably,
of that
as the regulator, he will have scope to vary that. I mean, who makes that?
No,
Who sets that hard and fast rule? Then how is that? How is that
that's in the bill
down?
That's
bill.
in the bill.
Yeah,
that's the
it hasn't yet become an act.
Idea behind...
Just by the way, Charlie, just to say, my understanding is that it's likely to become law in October rather than July. That's what I'm reading. But anyway. Yeah,
could be.
But so essentially, then, if the Premier League put forward a proposal which the regulator doesn't feel meets the criteria, or indeed the EFL puts forward a proposal that the regulator feels doesn't meet the criteria, it will be one or the other. So they have to be very careful about how they go about it. But equally, if they're clever, the proposal they put forward then could be the way football is run financially going forward, lock, stock and barrel.
That's correct. Now, of course, what will happen is during that 18-month period, which will start either in August or in October, depending on how quickly the bill becomes an act, What, of course, will happen is that these proposals won't come from out of the blue. They will come following a lot of discussions between both bodies and the regulator, but probably also both bodies between, on a bilateral basis themselves, because effectively this will kickstart the intention of both sides to say, well, rather than risking the other side's proposal becoming the blueprint, wouldn't it be better if we got together and effectively came up with a joint proposal? And that is what the government wants. So it's always important to remember the government wants the Football League and the Premier League to come up with their own joint decision. And this is, if you remember, this process of the regulator choosing one or the other is what's called the backstop, right? So the government and the regulator does not want to use that backstop, but it's held there as a threat to try to ensure that the two sides come together, either to produce their own joint proposal or else to make sure that the two proposals that they present to the backstop are as close as they possibly can be to each other, for fear of being ruled out of court and the other one being taken as the whole blueprint.
So just so I understand that then, the backstop is the scenario that you've outlined where it will be either the EFL proposal or the Premier League proposal. That is the backstop. That is the default. And the only way out of that is if the Premier League and the EFL get together and come forward effectively with one joint proposal. That then will become the financial model.
Exactly right. So effectively, let's just say take September as a sort of convenient sort of, halfway point between the two outcomes as to when the bill becomes an act. And you then play it forward 18 months from there, right? So that's towards May 2027, end of season 2027. So sort of March, April 2027. So in advance of season 27-28, there will be a new settlement, right? Now, effectively, what the government wants is in the summer of effectively sort of by next summer is for the two sides to have already come to their agreement by then, rather than going into the backstop 6 or 7 months later, right? But as it ticks down towards the backstop, one or other side will start to think, do you know what? This might be better if we push this into the backstop because we think the other side is being unreasonable. Now, obviously, I'm biased in this regard, having been an EFL club director, but I think most neutral observers would regard the Premier League's negotiating position to date to be fairly unreasonable, i.e. basically making a proposal, then withdrawing it, then blaming the EFL for them having not made a proposal. I mean, the whole thing was an absolute mess all over the place. So you can imagine a scenario by which if the Premier League, which is quite disunited at the moment, as you know, and is potentially unable to get together to come up with a unified position to negotiate with the Football League, you could imagine a situation by which the Football League thinks, do you know what? We think that our proposal is going to be closer to reality than the Premier League, who are quite arrogant and just think that they can say whatever the hell they want. Actually, we'd be better off here pushing it into a backstop rather than making an agreement up front. Now, the Premier League executive, who are not crazy or delusional, are sensible people, will be telling their clubs, guys, the last thing we want here is to get into the backstop. Because one thing is for certain, the Football League's proposal will include a major change to parachute payments, for sure. And we run the risk that the whole game review, because don't forget that parachute payments have been included in the regulator's remit, right? Do you remember that was a change that Labour have made to the bill? We run the risk of the whole game review, which will include parachute payments, concluding that parachute payments do distort competition in the Championship. And I think if you look at the Championship table today, it would be hard to argue the case that they don't, with the top three clubs being 20 points clear of the rest by dint of their parachute payments. And that therefore we, the Premier League, are better off coming to an agreement with the Football League, which protects at least most of the parachute payment system, rather than risking the whole thing going into the backstop and the Football League's proposal being chosen. And then you'll get the pushback from the crazy ones on the Premier League side saying, no, 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 how dare you? You go back there and tell everybody that we're right and they're wrong and all this type of stuff. And we'll be back in the old situation that we've been in, where the Premier League executive are actually not put in a position where they can negotiate because their club owners effectively won't let them. So that's what I'm saying. Watch this space over the next 6 months to a year, right? Kogan's going to be appointed. The bill is going to be passed into law. The whole game review will start. And at that point, the clock starts ticking towards the potential use of the backstop.
And the key issues at stake then are that, as you say, I suppose the whole game review gives a clue, really. This is how much money should be distributed by the Premier League, essentially money coming in from the Premier League's broadcasting revenues. How much of that should be distributed all the way down the pyramid, not just to the EFL, but to non-league, to grassroots football as well? How much should it be distributed? How much should be distributed,
well,
and how
not
should
really. It be
distributed?
So
No.
Well, no, because the grassroots are not included in this.
So this is just the professional.
This really is.
Yeah.
It's the professional game. This is the professional game. This is
Right.
the men's professional game. Women's game excluded, and
Yeah.
grassroots excluded.
Okay.
And there was much sort of frustration about that from women's game campaigners and from grassroots, etc. But this is very specifically to increase the sustainability of the men's professional game.
Okay, so how much should be distributed then down to the bottom of League Two? How that should be distributed division by division, and within that, I mean, that's problematic enough because the EFL will obviously be arguing for a greater proportion of the broadcasting revenues, and the Premier League clubs will be arguing for less. But also perhaps the most vexed issue, and one that we have discussed many times before, which is that of parachute payments, which the Premier League regards as essential to preserve its competitiveness. Because if relatively poor clubs in the Premier League have parachute payments, they can be confident in spending money, knowing that even if they're relegated to the EFL, relegated to the Championship, they will still be able to afford the exorbitant wage bills of a Premier League club or a recently relegated Premier League club. Whereas if you are in the EFL already, you'll see this as a massive distorting factor in your competition. And despite Luton's relegation straight down from the Premier League, the evidence suggests that it is a massively distorting factor in the Championship.
Yes, well, I mean, look, there's no doubt about that. And Luton, don't forget, are looking at their financial windfall in a very different way because they're looking to fund the building of a new stadium. And that has been their position. When they went up to the Premier League, they didn't spend much money. When they came down from the Premier League, they didn't spend much money because they're trying to fund a move from Kenilworth Road to a big new stadium, which is they regard as being more important for the future of their club than some short-term splurge on wages. So take Luton out of it, and what you'll find is that the three big parachute payment clubs, Leeds, Burnley, Sheffield United, are 20 points clear at the top of the Championship. And that's not, that can't be put down to, well, it's a sort of one-off or whatever it might be. All three of them are 20 points clear of the rest. And that's basically effectively two different leagues within a league, which is what the Football League has always argued is the case, etc. Incidentally, I don't think that the Premier League at any level really argues that they should be paying less.
Premier League, lest anybody doubt this, the Sunday Times did a deep dive into this, carried out by one of their journalists, Hamza Khalik Lunat, who is the Data Journalist of the Year. So it's pretty authoritative research, and just looked at the distribution of points between clubs at the top of the table and clubs at the bottom of the table. A really good piece of research from last month in the Sunday Times. And he says one method of seeing how equal something is by tallying up all the points in the league table and working out what share was contributed by whom. If one or two teams make up a large share, then it's an unequal table. If lots of teams have a relatively even share, then it's a more equal table. And he concludes, you probably won't be surprised to find that this season is more competitive than last year's, which was the most unequal top flight campaign since the Premier League moved to a 20-team division. But it is progressively, the trend is it is becoming progressively more unequal season after season. Let's talk about women's football, because Wolves women play in one of the feeder leagues to the Women's Championship. In fact, they've won that competition several years in a row, but have then subsequently failed to get into the Women's Championship via the playoffs. I saw them earlier this season. Wolves women beat my team, West Brom's women, by 8 goals to 0. They're really rather good. And they were playing a game, a title decider against Nottingham Forest, and they missed out after losing that game. They missed out on the top spot by three points, and Nottingham Forest have now won promotion to the Women's Championship. But just before that final game against Forest, Wolves women found out that their club had not submitted the paperwork that would have allowed them to compete in the Championship had they been successful and won the league. And that was partly because, according to briefings given by Wolves to various journalists, Wolves were wary. Wolves owned by Fosun International, Chinese owners. Wolves owners were wary about the additional financial commitment of playing in the Women's Championship. And that's as much as I know. But I just think it's really sad that a team could play a whole season hoping and believing that they were going to get into the next level, and then finding out that even had they been successful in doing so, their parent club apparently was not willing for them to go to that next level because of the cost.
Well, I'm a great believer that, people shouldn't be in a position to tell other people how to spend their own money. And, if somebody else wants to pay for it, then fine. But why should it be imposed on people that they have to spend money in a certain way, particularly as a result of being successful? Normally, when you think about it in life, you are successful, you earn more money. In women's football, unfortunately, when you're successful, you lose more money. That's the key thing to understand, right? The Championship in men's football is a loss-making division. In the Premier League level, if you want to make a profit, you easily can, right? So getting promoted from the Championship to the Premier League means you lose less money. Great, fantastic. Not so in women's football. Every time you get promoted, you lose more money.
If you were promoted, why would you automatically lose money? I mean, even if you're not getting bigger attendances, could you just not keep the squad that you have got, pay them the same wages, whatever they may be, and maybe take a punt on staying up? Why would it automatically cost more?
Right, because the third division, Adrian, in women's football is amateur and semi-professional. And the second division, the Championship, is professional. And whilst it has been a mixture of semi-professional and professional, under the new rules, they're moving towards a structure by which you have to be professional and you have to spend a certain minimum amount of money on your women's wages, right? So there is a significant difference. So probably you're moving from a situation where in the third,
and that would be a license, and that would be a license condition of being allowed to play in the Women's Championship. That's the paperwork that Wolves didn't fill in, because filling in that paperwork means that you take on this financial commitment, and that if you don't meet those commitments, then you can't play in the Women's Championship anyway.
That's exactly right. Something called minimum standards. Correct, because effectively the word professional, but in reality, some of the women are being paid so badly that they're being paid less than the minimum wage, except something called the Carney report that said effectively that English women's football should have 2 professional divisions, despite the fact that there were not the revenues there, even close to the revenues there, to support 2 professional divisions. And it's created this horrible situation where effectively even relatively prominent clubs like Baggies, Wolves, and these type of stuff are really not sure, or in many cases don't want to have professional teams. There was a team that was promoted relatively recently, from the third tier to the second tier, to the Championship. And I remember speaking to the chief executive after 3 or 4 months in the second tier, and he said, we're just desperate to get relegated. This is a horrible division to be in. It comes with no upside whatsoever. You don't get bigger crowds. You've got much bigger costs. You don't want to get promoted to the Women's Premier League because that comes with huge costs, and you're going to get beaten 5 or 6-0 every single week and end up with no points in the season. So why do I want to be in the second division? He was like, look, the third division was a happy place. It was a happy place to be. The players were basically amateur and got paid a bit to turn up. That was nice. But they had other jobs. They were PE teachers. They were, working sometimes in desk jobs, etc. And everyone was happy. He said, all I've seen in the second division of women's football is unhappiness. Everyone's unhappy. The players aren't paid enough to really be professional sports people. The crowds are tiny. No one wants to be promoted. Just the whole thing is an absolute misery. But unfortunately, this has all been swept up because of that ghastly Carney report. This has all been swept up into this whole, well, we have to try and make women's football equal to men's football, etc. Now, so what Wolves are looking at, and we have to remember that when Wolves made this decision, they were in some danger of being relegated from the Premier League to the Championship, at which point their own business model would have come under stress, right, at men's club level. So what you're looking at probably is going from a third division women's club costing somewhere between 150 to 250,000 pounds a year to run, to when you get to women's championship level, realistically, you are going to be losing something around £1 to £1.5 million a year, right? So it's an extra £1 million a year of cost for something which is of not obviously apparent additional value to you, because you don't see a big upswing in crowds. You don't want to get promoted to the division beyond that, because then the cost will go from £1.5 million a year to more like £3 or £4 million a year, which clubs outside the Premier League simply can't justify in any way, shape or form. So effectively what Wolves have decided is, we would rather continue to be the best amateur semi-pro club in the country and operate at as high level as we can there, rather than put this club into a division which is just a really bad, unhappy place to be. I respect that decision. I respect it. I think it's a decision with clarity about what we are and what we're not. We believe in women's football. We want to have a women's football team, but we want that women's football team to be happy. Now, you spoke about, well, perhaps they could keep all the same players. If they went from amateur football to professional football, they could, and then they'd be relegated straight away again with 2 points or 3 points in the whole season, right? Because the talent pool in women's football is very, very thin. And you cannot simply say, well, we're going to chuck a bunch of amateur players playing against a bunch of international professional players and expect them to do anything other than get thrashed every week, as happened to Portsmouth this season. Gained that promotion would have had to have been fired. So they would then have to have gone and found another third division club to play at, maybe the Baggies, etc. in some cases. So really, what would have been the point of the whole exercise? There would have been no point in the whole exercise. So
well, Charlie,
it's easy for people to get on their high horses.
Yeah, well, Charlie, I hear what you say, but I think at the very least, the players deserved transparency and they deserved honesty, and they weren't aware of this decision by the club. Beth Merrick, who plays for the club, wrote on X, imagine fighting for promotion all season to find out the championship bid was not submitted. As a group, we're absolutely devastated to finish the season this way and believe it speaks volumes about the club's ambitions for the women's team. So you may be right that Wolves have taken a sensible, sensible commercial decision, but you don't take those decisions and then not tell the key people at your club that you have taken that decision. That's wrong, surely.
Yes, it is. Yeah, 100% that's wrong. I'm a great believer that clarity in these things is important. I suspect that what has happened here is that there has been a mid-season review at Wolves, at which point they were in the relegation zone, if you remember, of the men's Premier League. They've started to do planning for the following season, and the finance director has been told, right, how can you cut £5 or £10 million out of our budget here? Because if we get relegated, we're going to be under a lot of stress. And he's gone, well, look, one thing that we really cannot afford is at the same time as the men's team get relegated, that the women's team get promoted and add an extra £1.5 million to our bills. We can't afford that. And effectively, that has then at that point not been communicated to the women's team, because it would be like, well, that would really derail their season and that would make it very hard for them to, sort of play and all that type of stuff. So I guess maybe a slightly cowardly failure to front it up, which, as you say, is ultimately never the right thing to do. Clarity and transparency should always be the default option. But do I think that Wolves are making a perfectly legitimate decision? Yes. The player who you mentioned, she said, I believe it speaks volumes about the ambitions of our club for their women. Yes, it does. It does speak volumes. That is absolutely correct. What it says is that Wolves have decided that certainly in the short to medium term, there is not an obvious commercial future for women's football. And it's interesting that when I was still at Charlton, and Charlton's got a prominent women's team who almost got promoted to the Women's Super League this year and last year, and is the sort of highest ranked sort of non-Premier League women's football club over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. So the one that's got the biggest problems with funding is Charlton. Now there's an independent club called London City, which has since come up under Michelle Kang, and she's a multi-billionairess, and she's on a mission to make women's sport this and that. And that's great. That's fantastic. That's her thing, and that's wonderful. But it was a massive issue for us, looking at it and understanding that effectively, much as we would be absolutely, from a sporting perspective, delighted to get promoted to the Women's Super League and proud of the players for that, it would create a series of problems, which is that the players who would have got us promoted could not play in Women's Super League. So over the last 2 seasons, Bristol City and then Crystal Palace have been promoted. And in both cases, they got 6 points in the entire season, right? I mean, it's an absolute disaster. You're getting tanked 5 or 6-0 every single week. But even then, most of the players who got them promoted were sacked off straight away anyway. So it wasn't even like it was some glorious thing for the players to get to play at a higher level. They were changed, but the players they were changed to couldn't win any games at Women's Super League either. And then the teams get relegated with everyone in floods of tears. And you look back and think, well, what? I wish we'd never got promoted in the first place, frankly. So the whole thing is a mess. And when we all got together back in, when I was running Charlton, and we were told in all candor and truth, look, this is going to take 5 years, right? Women's football is going to take 5 years to get things right, and you need to be committed for the duration of that period. So do I think it's unfair for Wolves to look at that and say, crikey, Riley, 5 years of significant losses? We'd rather not.
Charlie, thank you very much indeed. We'll be back again next week. Thanks to Jed Thomas for his production assistance and Mark Machado at 11:29 for handling the socials. Do follow me on Substack as well, adriangoldberg.substack.com, where you will find links to draft parts of my forthcoming book, Where's the Money Gone? And we'll continue for the next few weeks, even though the EFL season is over. Loads to talk about over the next few weeks. Thanks for listening.
It's not over. It's not over. It's only over for the Baggies. It's not over for Sunderland. It's not over for Charlton.